Okay, we're all set.
All right. Hello, everybody. Hello, East Providence High. And anybody else who's watching the recording after the fact. Oh, I can see the team. Hello, everybody. Uh, so, welcome to the information session for the wildlife section for this year's Envirothon 2025. For those who don't know me, my name's Mary Gannon. I'm the Wildlife Outreach Coordinator with DEM's Division of Fish and Wildlife. So, my job is to share information about our wildlife species, about our conservation projects, and get you guys ready for the wildlife test. So throughout the talk, I'll pause and I have breaks in here for questions. So I'd love to hear from you guys. And if you have any questions related to each section, I'm happy to answer them. And at the end, I'll also share my contact info. Feel free to email me, call me anytime, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Can't think of anything else off the top of my head, but here we go. Let's roll. So a little bit about the Division of Fish and Wildlife and about our mission. Our mission is to ensure that the freshwater and wildlife resources of the state of Rhode Island will be conserved and managed for equitable and sustainable use. So that means that everybody, all Rhode Islanders, no matter who you are, how old you are, where you come from, you should be able to access our wildlife resources equitably and sustainably. So that means into the future, my children and my grandchildren should be able to access these resources, whether that's through hunting and fishing or through bird watching, through just immersing yourself in nature. These are public resources. So we want to make sure that we care for them accordingly. So we work with a variety of species from mammals to birds to herptiles, that's reptiles and amphibians. Herpetofauna is the fun collective term for them. We work on habitat, a lot of habitat, and some invertebrates. And there's quite a few invertebrates in the state, but we have limited projects on them. Our biggest collaborative project is on American burying beetle, which is this cool black and orange beetle here. That's a great partner project we have with the zoo, with our population of burying beetles out on Block Island. We have some pollinator initiatives going on right now, but we mostly deal with mammals, birds, herps, and habitat for the most part. But everything counts, everything matters. It can be very daunting when you have quite a few species to take care of and limited staff and time to do it. So our main office, we hail out of the Great Swamp management area down here in West Kingston, but our collective office is made up of all of these big green blobs. Oops, I'm going to get rid of this message here so we can see these big green blobs here. And these are our management areas. So it's about 60,000 acres total across the state. They're multi-use, but their primary function is for habitat conservation, first and foremost, and then for hunting and fishing opportunity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Some really exciting news, some historic news to share with you guys. It was we did a press release and it's been covered by the news. We just acquired over 900 acres here in the northwest corner. So we have Buck Hill here. We've got George Washington, Durfee Hill, Pulaski Park in this section. And we just got a section of land, 942 acres, I believe. That was a former Boy Scout camp. So that collectively, with all of that land that we conserve up in that northwest corner now, that'll be about 13,000 acres of contiguous habitat, which is like a huge win for wildlife. I'm really excited about it, and all of our staff are really excited. That rivals Arcadia. So Arcadia is down in this section here. Arcadia is about 15,000 acres, so that's a big win for wildlife, and we always want to make sure that we have contiguous habitat for wildlife. And we'll talk about fragmentation and what is contiguous habitat in a little bit. But I just want to share that because I'm really excited. So if you visit a management area anytime between September to February and April and May, you should be wearing fluorescent orange, and that's to make sure that we all stay safe and visible in the woods during our hunting seasons. Right now, we are in the month of December, so you'll need 500 square inches. That's a hat and a vest because it is shotgun deer season. We want to make sure that everybody is safe. So I just tell everybody about this whenever I can because a lot of people don't know about it. So please spread the word. And we do have signage, but you got to kind of look for it, right? So know where you're going and know who allows hunting. Even some land trusts also allow hunting, so you should check before you go out in the woods. Make sure you know the rules of the of the land. So why do we manage wildlife in the first place? Why don't we just let nature take its course and do its own thing and kind of, let whatever happens happen? So we have to get in there and manage wildlife and conserve wildlife because they have a number of values, right? Wildlife species have recreational value, whether that's through, I really love to go bird watching. It's something fun that I like to do. Or, I like to go hunting or fishing. That is something that is a consumptive recreational use where you're harvesting wild game and consuming it. Economic value. So people, whether you're, consuming that animal and hunting and fishing, or you're just observing the animal, odds are you have some equipment that you have to buy to do that, whether it's binoculars or a bow and a set of arrows or a tree stand, or, clothing to get outside and stay warm. Whether you're traveling, many people travel to see wildlife or engage in different tourist activities like a whale watch or whatever that might be. That has economic value. So people love to look at wildlife, love to do these activities related to wildlife, and that all trickles into our economy as an industry, so to speak. And of course, we have just enjoying wildlife for its aesthetic beauty. It's wonderful and beautiful to look at and has inherent value. Sometimes, on the other hand, wildlife can cause issues for people, whether that's deer getting into a farm and wreaking havoc, bears getting into apiaries and wreaking havoc on beehives for honey producers, just people with general issues with nuisance wildlife in their backyard. They can't, and as we encroach on their space and expand, our towns and our cities and roads and development, we can come into conflicts with animals, so to speak. So trying to manage wildlife in a sustainable and responsible way, we're always trying to keep balance, so making sure that the needs of wildlife are met and also that the needs of people are met. Sounds easy, right? It's not. It can be very, very tricky to strike that balance. So everything that we do in terms of modern wildlife management is guided by the North American model for wildlife conservation. So there's 7 principles within the model, and it just to give you guys a sense of like our philosophy in wildlife management and where we're going with it. I'll go through the 7 principles really briefly, and there's some important legislation that kind of offshoots from the North American model that you should definitely know about. So of course, we mentioned wildlife's a public resource. It belongs to everybody, right? So we want to make sure that everyone cares about our wildlife and that we are managing and conserving our wildlife on behalf of all people to ensure that everyone has access to those resources. So markets for game are eliminated. That's the second principle from the North American model. Before wildlife protection laws were enacted, you could have commercial operations out there decimating populations of many different species. So for example, ducks, there was a huge market hunting industry for ducks. People would go out and harvest 100 ducks in a day. Not very sustainable if a bunch of people are doing that and selling them and attaching a monetary value to that harvested game, as opposed to just going out and hunting enough for your family. So making that illegal to buy and sell meat and parts of game and non-game species removed a huge threat to the survival of those species. There is still a market in fur bearers as a highly regulated activity. And that's a lot of times used to manage invasive wildlife or to balance populations. But there are a lot of rules and regulations attached to it. You can't just go out and do whatever you want, whenever you want. That's what we call poaching. So just 2 pieces of legislation that were incredibly important as it relates to this principle are the Lacey Act of 1900 and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. So the Lacey Act was our first federal law for wildlife protection in America, and it made it unlawful with a whole list of words, right? Import, export, sell, acquire, purchase, fish, wildlife, or plants that are taken from the wild, transported, sold. It's a big long list of do's and don'ts, mostly don'ts, but that prevented our interstate sale and trafficking of wildlife. It supported states' initiatives to restore our wildlife populations. And nowadays, wildlife shipments have to be clearly labeled. So, for example, we recently had to work with someone who works with snakes, non-native snakes, right, in the pet trade, and there are reptile breeders throughout the country and whatever, and the animals have to be quarantined and shipped back and forth and whatever. So, if you're shipping a snake for the pet industry and you have all the required paperwork and you're doing it the right way, those wildlife shipments have to be clearly labeled. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has like employees whose sole purpose is to check, at customs, making sure that things aren't being shipped illegally, that things aren't being, poached out of the wild. A huge, huge issue right now in North America is the poaching and export of wild turtles. So a few of our turtle species here in Rhode Island, like spotted turtles, box turtles, wood turtles, they occur throughout the eastern U.S. and they are targets for the illegal wildlife trade. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service every year catches people shipping turtles out of North America overseas for pets. And often they're stuffed in a sock so they can't move and they can't get their legs and their head out of their shell. And a lot of them die in transit because they're dehydrated or they're hungry. So it is a real problem. This act was written in 1900. We might think, oh, that's not an issue anymore. It's still an issue, and there are still people working to make sure that this is enforced and protect our wildlife. So Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, fairly closely followed, and that focused solely on birds because of this hat trade that was going on at the time. It was highly fashionable to have bird feathers on your hat, sometimes full taxidermied birds. And these are egret feathers in this lady's hat in particular. Egrets were highly sought after for the hat trade because of these gorgeous plumes. They're in their breeding plumage, and this caused such decimation to bird populations, particularly coastal birds. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act made it illegal to import, export, possess, take, transport, sell, all of this good stuff, or bad stuff, I should say. The birds themselves, feathers, nests, or eggs, because eggs were even a problem. People were going out to gull colonies and scooping up a whole bunch of eggs and effectively decimating the breeding populations of these birds along the East Coast. So this initiative, this act was actually initiated by women in Boston who were like, this is just terrible. Like all of this devastation and destruction for hats. Like, can we do something? Can't we do better? Which is really cool. So it shows you how amazing the grassroots efforts can be in terms of helping wildlife. There are some exceptions to that rule. So there's obviously regulated hunting of game species. So it is illegal to harvest birds out of the wild, except certain species during certain seasons with certain bag limits dictated by your state wildlife agency that is based in science. So there's a lot of rules and regulations that go into that before you can take a bird out of the wild. And then there's also for scientific research. So generally, like capturing birds and moving them or handling them or what we would consider like harassing birds, stressing them out. That's all against the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, except if it is through scientific research that has been approved and given a permit for. So, for example, bird banding is one example of that, where you're catching birds, giving them a little leg band. So this is an aluminum leg band. It's lightweight. It spins freely on the bird's leg. It's no different than you wearing a loose-fitting bracelet. We banned waterfowl, geese, ducks annually. Many researchers ban songbirds or shorebirds. So that's all done with the permitting process and for the purpose of research that we can conserve the birds. And the last exception is for Native American cultural ceremonies. So feathers are often used for powwow regalia, for different religious ceremonies. So there's a whole, you could go into that more in depth into that, but just so that there are exceptions. our third principle, allocation of wildlife by law. So wildlife is that public resource. It's managed by the government. And as a result, access to wildlife for hunting is through legal mechanisms like the set hunting seasons, the bag limits, getting your hunting license. So then that way we're protecting wildlife by having those laws in place. So there's a lot of checks and balances so that nobody's over harvesting or poaching wildlife. So a couple of acts that have really helped with this and with conservation here in the United States is the Duck Stamp Act, 1934. So this is this cool little stamp. It's an art contest every year, and all waterfowl hunters ages 16 and up have to purchase a federal duck stamp. And in Rhode Island, you additionally have to purchase a state duck stamp. And that the funding from those purchases goes into conserving wetland habitat in national wildlife refuges. And it's pretty amazing. It's 98% of the sales money is used towards that. So there's a very low percentage goes to like administration costs, et cetera. Like most of it is going to the conservation projects. It's about $800 million have been raised through the Duck Stamp Act, which is pretty awesome. And you don't have to be a hunter to get a duck stamp. There are people who just collect them because they're these little tiny mini works of art that they collect them in a stamp book and look forward to purchasing every year. The Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937 is the big one that pays my salary, right? So it pays for a lot of conservation work. It is pretty much the primary source of funding that we have here in Rhode Island, and we have, the duck stamp and hunting licenses, et cetera. But this is our main bread and butter for how we get the work done that we do, and how we acquire land and how we fund research. So this is a pretty interesting funding source because it was directed at hunters and anglers to begin with, or I should say hunters to begin with. There's a separate act for fishing that Kim Sullivan will most likely talk about with you. But it was directed at hunters because hunters are, the ones who are engaging with the wildlife, harvesting wildlife out of the environment. So they should be putting some money into conservation. And it was written at a time where game species in particular, so species that are hunted, were at an all-time low. So the concept of this is that and today we call it the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program. It's this kind of all-encompassing program where anglers, boaters, hunters, target shooters, so people who just shoot like clays at the shotgun range, or target archery folks, they buy their equipment, manufacturers pay an excise tax on that. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife takes all of that excise tax money, allocates it out to all of the states through a bunch of complex math. And then the states have to use it for restoration, habitat acquisition, research and monitoring, education, all that good stuff. And it's protected. So it cannot be used to fix the bridge. It cannot be used to fix the potholes, where state, officials can say, oh, you know what, Fish and Wildlife has a lot of money. We can just, funnel it over there. Nope, it's protected for our wildlife. And it's wonderful because it has worked really well. It's not a perfect system, because when it was written, it was originally directed towards habitat, birds, and mammals. And as we know, there are many other critters that are not birds or mammals that certainly do matter in the conservation scheme. So to help with that, we have state and tribal wildlife grants. This was an add-on to Pittman-Robertson in 2000. So states and tribes can receive funding by writing a wildlife action plan and revising that every 10 years. And that action plan targets our species of greatest conservation need. So right now we have 454 species of greatest conservation need on our action plan in Rhode Island. We're currently revising it for 2025. And we're looking at the threats to those species and their habitats, and then the actions we're going to take to help keep those critters on the map. So some things in the action plan could be critically state endangered, or they could be fairly common. But we try to keep the common stuff common, but we recognize, if we don't do anything to be proactive, then this animal could face a threat in the future. So we're always trying to think ahead, and because once you get something down to like, oh, there's only 25 left, it's really hard to restore a population when it gets that low. So it's easier to keep common things common and support them as best we can so that they don't experience those declines in the first place. Yes, so that's where we're going with that. So also, along with the North American model, wildlife can only be killed for a legitimate purpose. So it should not be waste. Like wildlife resources should not be wasted. So if you are going to hunt, it is expected that you would be utilizing that animal in some way, shape, or form. Or maybe you have to remove an animal. If you have a farm and you've got deer that are coming in and totally destroying your apple crop or whatever it might be, then you may have to remove those animals from your farm. But that is for a specific purpose. It's not just because you have a personal vendetta against deer, right? You're trying to protect your livelihood and your business. But we're not just killing wildlife just for the heck of it. Wildlife species are considered an international resource. So especially things like migratory birds, they cross national boundaries. They don't know whether they're in the United States or Canada or Mexico, right? They just fly along the flyway. So we have treaties like the Migratory Bird Treaty and the Convention for the International Trade. Oh my gosh, I always mess up CITES. The Convention for the International Trade of Endangered Species recognize that there's a shared responsibility to manage our species across national boundaries, which is pretty cool that we share species with different countries. So it's kind of a unifying thing. Science is, of course, the proper tool for discharging our wildlife policies. So if we want to manage wildlife as a shared resource fairly, objectively, and knowledgeably, we have to make those decisions based on sound science, like annual waterfowl population surveys or community science observations. We're not just making up rules because I feel like it on a Tuesday, right? It's got to be for with that scientific evidence backing it up. And last but not least, there is a democracy to hunting. So we always want to make sure that that everybody has access to our wildlife without regard for whether you're rich or poor, whether you own land or not, whether you live in the city or the country, what race you are, your age, where what country you've come from. Everybody has that access to hunting, and we want to encourage people to feel welcome in the sport and that they can also be participants in conservation. So we're going to take a question break with my cute little ducklings here. Does anybody have any questions about the North American model, about the laws? Kind of like, I don't want to say the boring part of it, but it's history. I don't know if you like history, then it's exciting, but
We're looking pretty good over here, but thank you.
right. Okay, we'll keep going. So we'll go into our basic concepts. So we've got a few different basic concepts that I think are helpful to know. And you should know these for the test, and we'll go through each of them individually. So carrying capacity, this kind of goes with what I was talking about at the beginning. Why do we manage wildlife? We want to make sure that our populations are at a healthy level, that biologically at a healthy level. So if a population of deer hits their biological carrying capacity, that means that the environment can no longer support any more deer because the resources have been used up amongst that population. So we're always trying to make sure that we manage wildlife in a responsible way, that we are keeping in mind that biological carrying capacity, not taking too many animals, not taking too few animals sometimes. Because if you hit that biological carrying capacity, you can have trickle-down effects that negatively impact other species in the environment. So for example, again, deer, we got a lot of deer in Rhode Island, and they eat a lot of the understory in the forest, so much so that they can reduce cover for songbirds, or they can reduce food for other animals, reduce forest regeneration. So we have a very generous bag limit on deer in Rhode Island because we could use to reduce them a little bit. Whereas like I would say something like spotted salamanders, which is a beautiful little salamander, very unassuming, lives in the forest, uses vernal pools to breed in the spring. Our environment could probably support more of them if humans had not developed so much land and filled so many vernal pools, right? So they're kind of at a lower population level. We want to encourage them to grow. That's kind of a weird dichotomy that I used there, but I'm trying to think of examples on the fly here. And then of course we have cultural carrying capacity, which is totally different than biological carrying capacity because they could be so vastly different, where your biological carrying capacity for coyotes could be pretty high in Rhode Island because they eat everything from mice to rats to rabbits to deer, to stuff in your garbage can, to the cat food that you leave out for the stray cat, right? They eat everything. They're not picky. So their biological carrying capacity is pretty high, but our cultural carrying capacity here in Rhode Island may be a heck of a lot lower for coyotes because people are like, it's in my backyard. It's eating my cat food. It's eating my cat. So we're always trying to like strike the balance between those two. And a lot of times that's just through outreach and education and getting people aware of, changing our own behavior in order to avoid conflict. And then maybe that raises our cultural carrying capacity of these animals. Fragmentation is the biggest thing going on here in Rhode Island, I would say. That's when we're chopping our habitat into smaller and smaller pieces. So I was talking about that land acquisition we just got up in the northwest corner of Rhode Island, increasing our contiguous habitat, this awesome word contiguous. So meaning that our habitat is connected and that an animal can transport itself from here to here without encountering any issues. Whereas if you're in a fragmented landscape, you're over here and you want to come over here to get some food or water, you're going to have to cross through roads, through parking lots, through people's backyards to get to the next patch of habitat. So we see a lot of that fragmented habitat here in Rhode Island. Something like a skunk is going to thrive in the fragmented habitat. They're more than happy to live in the woods and also more than happy to dig grubs out of your lawn in the suburbs. Something like a spotted salamander, not so much. They've got short legs. It's hard for them to cross roads. They need that contiguous habitat with a lot of interior habitat. So our interior habitat is in the dark green and edge habitat would be in this light green. So when you have contiguous habitat, your edge, the surface area of your edge is a lot smaller than if you have fragmented habitat. Look at all that edge. There's just so much edge because there's all of these little chunks with very little interior habitat. Like, look at how thin it can get in some places. So we're always trying, our goal at Fish and Wildlife is always trying to increase that interior habitat as best we can in a very fragmented landscape as like the last holdout for our wildlife. Biodiversity, the variety of life in an ecosystem. Another big goal of ours is to always support our state's biodiversity. We're a very tiny state. We're always trying to do the most we can for as many species as possible with limited staff and limited funding resources. So that's where the habitat protection comes in handy, because if you could protect habitat and just leave it and let it do its thing with some, manipulation and management, then we can support our biodiversity. And that's the key to a healthy ecosystem. Habitat succession is, looking at our habitat as it is disturbed. So whether that's through a fire, a windstorm, through, mechanical means due to people, our habitat is it's not static, right? It changes over time. So we would start with early successional habitat with you have a field, an open meadow, which will eventually transition to some shrubs with small trees. Then your trees get bigger and your shrubs get bigger and you have fewer grasses and flowers. And then you're going to keep moving forward and having more young trees or tons of young trees and a few older trees, a few shrubs. And then at your latest stage of succession, you're really looking at older trees all together with very little understory because these big guys are shading out the shrubs and smaller trees underneath them. So different species of wildlife use different stages of succession. Some of them use multiple stages of succession. So it's always good to have a little bit of everything on the landscape so that it's like one-stop shopping for wildlife. Oh, I can go in the field. Oh, I can get some berries from some shrubs, but I can also nest in this old tree or whatever it might be. Invasive species, these are non-native plant or animal that's been introduced to an area, and that's going to cause negative impacts. So things like red-eared sliders, this adorable turtle that was very popular in the pet trade. Thanks, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, for making everybody want a turtle, and then realizing turtles can be very difficult to take care of. So people threw them in a bunch of ponds, let them go, and now we have an invasive species. They're normally from the southern U.S. So they compete for resources with our native turtles. Autumn olive, this is one of our most widespread invasive plants on our landscape. We winter mow a lot of our sections of our management areas when all the animals are asleep or have migrated. Winter mowing to take down these big shrubs because they'll just take over. You'll see them on the highway. You could see them in old fields. You could see them on the side of the road. They just will colonize any empty space they can. And create this just monoculture, which is not great because we want plant diversity as well. The berries are delicious, though. You can eat them. You can eat your invasive species. Make some jam and help prevent the spread. Just make sure you know what you're looking at. Be very confident in your identification, and maybe don't pick them from the side of the highway. Like, go into a management area, pick them there. No one will mind. Please pick them. So wildlife disease, some diseases that we're constantly on the lookout for in Rhode Island is chronic wasting disease in deer. So this deer right here is an example of chronic wasting disease, highly malnourished. It's a prion that attacks their brain and then slowly atrophies all of their muscles. It is awful. It is always fatal. And it's spread very quickly through saliva, through feces, through urine. It can live in the soil for years on end. So we're constantly monitoring for chronic wasting disease in Rhode Island. We have hunters who allow us to take lymph node samples from deer every year at our deer check stations. If you're interested in volunteering, we take volunteers. If you'd like to dissect things or if you just want to help take data, that's cool. But we do not have it in Rhode Island yet. We're constantly monitoring for it, always on the lookout, but we do not have it in Rhode Island yet. But it is running rampant in other states, particularly states that have had game farms where people do raise deer on a farm. It's just a higher concentration of animals, and it's escaped out from the game farms into the wild through those means of spread. White nose syndrome in bats we do have in Rhode Island, and it's pretty much all across the U.S. right now, except for the Southwest. Bats pick it up in caves. So you can see this little bat, his nose is white and kind of fuzzy. It's a fungus that grows on their face and on their wing membranes. And it can scar their skin on their wings. It disorients them. It can cause them to come out of their hibernation state more frequently. They dehydrate, they get hungry. They're coming out, flying out looking for something to eat in the winter, using up energy. And it can be very fatal. We've lost millions of bats to this disease across the country. And we do monitor for it in Rhode Island. We have found that some bats have survived because you can see the scars on their wings. So there is hope that bats, there are some bats that are resistant to it. The fungus, it's unknown really where it came from. It's kind of like poof, appeared. There's speculation that it came from Europe. And it can be spread, on people's clothing if they're exploring caves or hiking or whatever. So we do see it in bats here in Rhode Island, and we've seen decline of little brown bats in particular in Rhode Island. Big brown bats can be affected by it. Northern long-eared bat is another one. These are our species that travel north to hibernate in caves. We have bats that go up to Vermont to hibernate there. We do have some limited hibernacula in Rhode Island where we have found white nose syndrome, but we're just seeing fewer and fewer bats coming back. But there is hope because there are some that are resistant to it. Their recovery may be slow though, because bats only have one baby a year. So it may just take them a while to catch up, but there's been a ton of national research on this disease to try to keep our bats safe and to help them because bats are very important in the ecosystem. Chytrid fungus and ranavirus are two that affect reptiles and amphibians. So this turtle has ranavirus in this picture. Chytrid fungus is more for amphibians. Ranavirus can be for both reptiles and amphibians. This can get spread on, if you go kayaking and you bring your kayak from one pond and then next week you go to a totally different pond, you can spread these two diseases by not washing your kayak. So we recommend folks to wash kayaks with some soap and water, a bleach solution, let it sit in the sun, and that should kill off any of those diseases. So anytime like I use my waders at work or my boots, or I go, in a kayak or a boat at work, we have like a sanitation station at our office where we scrub everything down because we're going in a lot of different wetlands throughout the season. Triple E and West Nile virus, that should be West Nile virus, WNV, not WNS. WNS is white nose syndrome. So Triple E and West Nile virus are both mosquito-borne, can affect birds, can affect people. We have tested deer at our deer check station for both of these, taking blood samples, working with the Department of Health. And then avian influenza is another one. That's really, it could be all birds, but waterfowl can be particularly hit by it. Questions? Take another break. Oh, I'm seeing the chat. Hold on. I haven't checked the chat. Okay. So
Hello.
Mr. Zabel, hello. Oh, Natalie's got a
Oh,
question.
sorry. We were interested in learning more about the deer check stations. Could you tell us more or just send us some more information about it? I know I did it last month and I would love to do it again, but there's also some kids who are interested.
Yeah.
And
so
like
deer
for
check.
like under 18.
Yeah. So you just need to we have a form, for kids under 18 through our volunteer program. And I can, if anybody is interested and you want to send me an email, I can forward your contact info to our volunteer team, and then they'll put you on the list where they send to all of our volunteers being like, hey, we've got this opportunity coming up. Anybody want to sign up? Here's the time slots, etc. So Deer Check is closed for this year. Our next check stations are actually this weekend, but we're full for volunteers. So you'll have to wait until next November to do that. So it's usually the first weekend of November, first weekend of December. And you'll help the biologists, get the deer out of the truck. They weigh them, they measure them, they take out teeth, they look at the teeth to try to age them, take out the lymph nodes if the hunter's okay with it. Because sometimes hunters will save, they want to taxidermy, if they, shot a particularly beautiful buck that year, they might want to save it. So they don't want, cuts, because we cut the cheek open, we cut the throat open to do our sampling. But most of the time, they're really happy to help and, contribute to the data. So I will say, if you're a little squeamish and you're not okay with blood or things that might smell or ticks, it may not be the one for you, but it is really interesting to get to see them up close. And I love dissecting things. I don't hunt myself. I would struggle with it, but I'm perfectly happy to dissect stuff.
Yeah, Eric had a question, and I
Yes.
don't know what information you might have. What's the status of canned hunting at the preserve?
Yes. So that's like a whole legal thing. As of right now, there is no canned hunting except for pheasant hunting. And so pheasant hunting falls under a different thing because pheasants are non-native. We stock them. We could go down a rabbit hole talking about pheasant hunting and why we do it. So there are pheasants there. I'm not sure if they do quail there as well, or maybe chukar, partridge. But so for those who don't know, there was some news about a private hunting club, sporting club importing elk into Rhode Island to have like elk hunts. So they would be, the animals would be, fenced within, the acreage that they have, and then they take people on guided hunts to hunt elk. that was, we strongly opposed that as a division because, again, with like disease concerns, because chronic wasting disease can affect not only white-tailed deer, but any deer species, which include elk and moose. So to import animals probably from a captive breeding facility into our tiny state, it, God forbid, any one of them was diseased, it got into our population, that would be absolutely devastating to our deer population and to deer hunting in the state, and then our funding for the rest of the conservation work that we do, right? It's this big like cascade effect. So there was some legislation that went through this year to look at that and to address that, but as of right now, there's no canned hunting of like large game in the state. In other states like Texas, you can go to Texas and go to game reserves where they have, you know, hogs, or they'll like raise like exotics like, you know, like springbok and antelope and things like that, like African species where you can go on, you know, like guided hunts to do that sort of thing. We don't do that here in Rhode Island. We really don't have the space to be doing that. And we focus on our native wildlife and supporting a hunting culture by you know, making sure our native wildlife are healthy and doing well to support, to like sustain a hunting season. That's a great question. Did that answer it? I feel like that I was like I hope that wasn't like vague. I want to be like sensitive.
No, that was spot on. I'd heard the radio, you know, a radio talk show banter about it. And I thought that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. The fact that people would do it in the first place. But in Rhode Island, well, I mean, it just seemed nuts. So I'm
Right.
happy to hear that people are pushing it back against it at least.
Right. And we have great deer hunting here. Like we do,
Right.
like there's a lot of deer, you know what I mean? So like we're trying to encourage people, you know, purchase your license, become a responsible hunter, harvest your meat, you know what I mean? Wild
Right.
game, you know, it's the most organic you could get, you know, so like working on that messaging to help people understand hunting and like not have it be this like canned hunting honestly doesn't look good from a public perspective if you're trying to get people comfortable with hunting. So yeah, it's just like it's a can of worms. We could talk a lot about that.
Mhm. Right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? All right. We'll charge ahead. I love this picture of this deer. Dean Birch is a local photographer who's lovely. He donates so many of his photos, but I love this one because this buck has just shed his velvet. And so you can see his antlers look a little red because velvet, the fuzzy stuff on the outside of the antler, has blood vessels in it. So so it can look kind of like bloody and gross when it comes off, but then the bone hardens underneath. But he's just looking so like fresh and clean and getting ready for the winter. Okay, so the theme for the national competition this year is, you know, forests and forest resiliency and thinking about forests in a time of change. So we'll focus a little bit on forest stewardship for wildlife and what we're doing here in Rhode Island. So our goal for forests from a wildlife perspective is forest diversity, whether that's age classes of forests. So looking at when we're talking about that succession, you know, the meadow versus the shrubs versus the young forest, the old forest. We want all of that on the landscape. So we're focusing a lot on creating young forest and shrubland in Rhode Island because we don't have a ton of it, or if we have it, it's like you know, invaded by invasive plant species, and we want quality young forest habitat, not just a bunch of like multiflora rose brambles. That's not very helpful or diverse for wildlife. So looking at, you know, a diversity of age on the landscape, most of our forest is about 70 to 100 years old at this point. Rhode Island went through a period of intensive clearing because of European settlement and agriculture. And then it grew up a little bit, you know, as people abandoned farms, and it was all kind of cut at the same time again. So our forest has gone through this, as opposed to like pockets being cut or burned or knocked down, and then they spring up here and there. It's like all of it kind of mowed down at the same time. So 70 to 100-year-old forest is wonderful for many species of wildlife, but if that's the only thing on the landscape, then that can limit our biodiversity. And then we're also looking to support unique forest types. So not all forests, you can't just go out in the woods and be like, yeah, it's the woods, right? No, there are different soils and different tree species that grow in those different soil conditions. It's a very unique forest types that we have in Rhode Island, particularly pitch pine barren. That's one that's shrinking. In the state, we've got forested wetland like Atlantic white cedar swamps. We have oak hickory forests. We have red maple swamps. You have all these different types of, you've got your mixed hardwood with like mixed pine with oak forest. So all of those have different values, but we always want to make sure that we don't lose very unique forest types on the landscape. We'll talk about a little bit about pitch pine. So to get started, how do we keep pitch pine barrens on the landscape? So this is like sandy soil, not a lot of plant diversity. It's a lot of early successional species. It's like an open landscape, right? So it's almost reminds you like a savanna, right? So you've got a lot of open understory, a lot of sunlight coming in. This is, the understory should be blueberry, huckleberry, wildflowers, some native grasses. And what can happen with pitch pine is that white pine which is a native tree, it's not invasive or non-native. White pine can colonize an area and it crowds out everything. And then you just have this stand of thick white pine and nothing else growing there. And it will outcompete the pitch pine. So what we do to encourage that pitch pine barren and that unique plant community is we'll burn the area. So we thin out the white pines first. So this is after white pines have been chopped down. It's the process is mastication. So there's like this cool like tool that like chops down the trees and like crunches them up into little pieces. We leave all of that on the ground as fuel for the fire. And I say I have never gone on a prescribed burn. They were just talking about it like we can go through training. All staff can access the training and then help on these burns, which is pretty cool. So there's like a whole crew of my coworkers at Fish and Wildlife who help forestry with this. So they go out, they chop down those trees, and then they set the fire. So the fire is low on the ground. It's burning off all of that, junk on the ground. I'll say all of that, mulch basically of white pine. It's, releasing seeds in the seed bank by opening up, burning off a layer of organic material. It will scorch things like blueberry. It'll scorch, pitch pines. There sometimes like an entire pine will just go poof. It's not really what they want for the whole thing, but sometimes they'll catch. And that pitch pine will be sprouting new branches within the next growing season. So this is usually done very early in the spring. And there's a burn window that they have. They can't do it on a day that's too wet or too dry or too windy. It has to be like, it's kind of like a let's watch, and then it's all hands on deck. Let's go and do our burn. So this is an example of like what the burn map would look like here at Nicholas Farm Management Area in Coventry. So it's like, smaller sections, like they'll burn 35 acres at a time, 45 acres at a time. Sounds like a lot, but it's really not in the grand scheme of like thousands of acres. I think Nicholas Farm is about 3,000 acres, but this is that barrens community here that we want to encourage to continue to be there. So it's very cool. Fire ecology is very interesting. Pitch pines are a fire adapted species. They need it on the landscape to persist. And if you go there like now, well, not now because there's no leaves on the trees, but if you go in May, it's amazing because you'll see tons of blueberry in the understory, tons of new growth. And that could be like, they could burn in like early April, and then by late May, early June, it's like, oh, like it explodes. So it's a quick turnaround time. So it's very cool to see how the ecosystem responds to it. And we do all of this, lots of different species use it, but frosted elfin butterflies as a particular habitat specialist for this habitat type. It eats these two plants, wild indigo and wild lupin, and those two grow in pitch pine barren communities. So we're always trying to, this is like a very little tiny unassuming brown butterfly. Like it's not flashy like the monarch, but it's an important pollinator and it matters. So it's very cool that we get to help this little guy. So then for young forest and early successional habitat, we do clear cuts. So there's like a specific recipe for the clear cut, right? So we're not just going out and cutting everything down all at once and like mowing it and calling it a day. There's a science to it. So they leave, the forester will leave 5 to 10 trees per acre. So this is like a really beautiful oak right here. It's going to drop all of its acorns next year and hopefully reseed the area. They'll leave standing dead trees called snags. Those are great for wildlife, whether it's a woodpecker getting in there to make a nest cavity, or bats utilizing it as a roost site, or food source for birds looking for insects. Snags are great, so we'll leave those up. We cut so if whatever trees they cut, the logger will take the sellable timber. They'll cut the crown off the tree, leave the branches and large slash, that's what we call it, on the ground. And they'll make brush piles out of it for wildlife to use for homes. And they designate where the machinery is going to go. So it's going to not compact the soil or destroy the soil. They want to be very careful as they're doing it. And there's time of year restrictions for that too, because of course you have birds that are in there nesting, you have reptiles and amphibians that are active. So they usually do it at a time of year where everything is inactive and they have a window and they got to stick with that window. And if they run out of time, that's it. So they run out of time. So these are great. We've done them a number of places around the state. So all these little red stars showing you where we've done some forestry work. And this is an example. This is up at Buck Hill here in the northwest corner. So this is a clear cut. And I'm not sure how many years later this was. My guess is it's under 10 years since they did this cut, and it's thick with vegetation. So we've got lots of beautiful baby trees growing in there, lots of early successional species like birch and aspen, little baby oaks. And then eventually this will grow back up into a mature forest, and we'll let it, do its thing and move onwards. So we're always making like little patches of this young forest to support 2 different species, but really a lot of different species. Our 2 focal species are New England cottontail, that's our native rabbit. Eastern cottontails are non-native. They were introduced for hunting purposes. They're from the more southern US. They live everywhere, wide open. New England cottontail prefers thick brambles and shrubland, young forest. American woodcock is an awesome little bird. It does its mating display out in a field in the spring. It lays its eggs in a ground nest in the young forest with all of that great cover. And then they'll go into the wetlands and eat worms and bugs from stream beds. These are our 2 poster children for young forest, but we can support a wide array of species by managing habitat for them. Young forest can be very good at sequestering carbon because the vegetation is growing so quickly. It's putting on a lot of biomass as that young forest is growing up, and it's holding that carbon. And old trees, of course, are great, sources of carbon. We're putting them back into the soil, leaving stuff on the soil to build that soil and hold that carbon in place. We're adding that diversity to the landscape and breaking up that even-aged forest. So here's some of our species of what we'd call, so like the woodcock or the New England cottontail, we would call it an umbrella species because all of these critters fall under the umbrella. If you create that habitat for those, umbrella species, the poster child species, you're going to be helping a variety of critters. It's like 40 species of songbirds use young forest, and even some interior forest birds like scarlet tanager and ovenbird. These guys are using mature forest for their nesting, but they'll pop into the young forest, grab some berries, grab some insects, go back into the older forest to do the rest of their life cycle. Or even as they're migrating, they might use young forest to support them on their journey. And then last but not least, I just wanted to touch on, thinking about our forests, thinking about change, thinking about climate change, development. Our forests are at risk of loss due to development, whether that's housing or business or whatever, but also due to renewable energy. So here in Rhode Island, we don't have any legislation per se what we do, it's there is some protection on core forest areas, so larger tracts of forest that can't be touched by solar or wind. But as a department, and we encourage people to be thinking about zoning renewable energy on already developed land. So like a brownfield site, an old landfill, or over a parking lot, or on a rooftop of a store, big box store, something like that, as opposed to what we've seen happen. And I think now people are trying to put the brakes on it a little bit, is that losing, people, a developer, a solar developer buys a tract of forest that's up for sale, whether that's, privately owned, maybe it's a farm that they're saying, oh, they're going to sell the farm, they can't afford to keep it anymore. They're buying up that open space, cutting down the forest, and then throwing a solar array on it. That was previously undeveloped land. So we're really, that is something that as wildlife conservationists we're concerned about. I'm not against renewable energy per se, but it's something that we got to be mindful of and balancing, keeping that balance. So that's all I'm going to say about that. With that, I'll take more questions, comments, concerns. I will tell you guys before we dive into questions that I do have a study guide for you guys this year. I have a PDF, and I will send it over to Paul and Pete, and they can post it and send it out to everybody. But there's a one-pager like last year. This year, it looks pretty much the same, but I've changed up the birds. They're all forest birds. Because to go with the theme of forests. So, phew, I made it with 56 minutes.
Any questions from Natalie's group?
She's coming.
Hello. Will you send us the list of birds? We're very, very curious about them. In an email, Paul, or post it on the website, or how can we know about these new birds?
It'll be put up, the PDF will be put up on the Rhode Island Envirothon files that everybody has access to. All the
Okay.
registration information is there. Any of the PowerPoints that have been used for these presentations I put up. I just put the aquatics recording up on the Rhode Island Envirothon YouTube page. So that'll all be there, but any of the other files or anything are on the Rhode Island Envirothon files that all of the advisors have access to.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool.
Meeting again for soils on the 10th.
Yep. Going forward.
Yep.
Am I heard?
Yes, we're all
Yeah,
we're all
yeah,
set.
we-
And then May 3rd is the field day workshop.
Yes.
I'll put it on my calendar.
Okay. It's
Okay,
gonna
and we're looking-
it's
look
gonna
at
be a
the snow.
campy hunty. Hopefully.
No, they said the bridge is in.
Okay.
Hope it doesn't wash away.
Yeah. And so we've got the soil Zoom coming up, and then the only other major thing that we have going right now is when we would hold the special topic workshop and where.
Yes.
So that'll be coming up as well.
Very much. We'll see you on Tuesday.
Okay. No further
right.
questions. Thanks a lot.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.